Well, good morning. It's great seeing all of you here this morning, and I think we need to start off this morning by giving all the moms a big round of applause this morning for Mother's Day. So happy Mother's Day to all the mothers. It's great having you here today, and I'm thankful to have my wife, who's the mother of our 5 here, and also, of course, 2 other ladies in my life that mean a lot, my mom as well as my mother-in-law. So thankful for all you moms. I know this is a thankless job. But if it weren't for you, none of us would be here. Isn't that right? So we thank you and appreciate you, and hope you are spoiled rotten by the end of the day today, okay? So I'm excited today that we're continuing this series, and if you haven't been with us over the past few weeks, we've been in this series entitled, Here is in Heaven. And if you don't know what that's all about, what we've been talking about very simply is the life of Jesus. How that Jesus left the heavens to come to this earth to bring what is true in the heavens into this world that's filled with all these lies and all these distortions and things, so that we can know the truth and we can be set free by the truth and live here as in heaven. So I want to talk to you a little bit about something Jesus spoke to and what he said years ago, of course, that's so powerful. But before we get to that, I want to begin by telling you that as someone who grew up in the 80s and 90s, I tend to think of myself today as still being quite young. I still think of myself as somewhat hip, somewhat cool, a little bit. And the reason for that is because I'm not yelling, get off my lawn at kids yet in the neighborhood. That's one reason. Another reason is that when I go to the gym, I still like to listen to rock and roll and even some of the new rap that's out today that's clean, okay, the clean stuff. And so I do like that. Now, some of y'all don't now see me as a pastor anymore, whatever, but that's some of the things I like. And there's times that as I look at myself in the mirror, I tend to just say, you still have it done. I've still got it. I tend to think that. However, as you might imagine, my kids, they have a totally different view of me. That what they have to say is that I'm old, and I'm not just, old, I'm old in their view, and so they're always telling me this, and up until this past week, I used to really push back and debate them over this, but then there were a few things that happened this last week that began to soften my position on my stance where I've defended myself as being quite young. The first thing is I celebrated another year of life. And when I began to put the calculations to that and the number that I hit, which I'm not going to tell you, I'm rapidly approaching the mid-century mark, okay? So I think it's time for me to start saying, okay, I'm kind of old. I'm not real old, but I'm kind of old. But there was another thing that happened, and it was this past week I went through our dining room, or our living room, and I pulled out the yearbook from my senior year, and I looked at my senior picture, and this is quite embarrassing, but there it is. And I looked at that, and I thought, I am old. And for those of you that weren't around back then, the hairstyle that you see there is what we called the bowl cut back in the day, which what made a bowl cut what it was is you had about 12 pounds of hair on top of your head with very little to no hair around the sides and the back of your head. And I do believe I probably used my mom's entire can of hairspray on that day for that picture to hold that. I do hope, and I'm sure many of you believe this as well, I hope that hairstyle never comes back because there'd be a lot of toxic chemicals with hairspray, but beyond that, I could never grow that amount of hair on my head again. Never could pull that off. All right, let's get that off. That's embarrassing. So those were 2 of the things, the number I hit, seeing my senior picture, but then there was something else that was totally, for real. I didn't expect this at all. I went and looked at a movie, one of my all-time favorite movies, just an absolute work of art as a film. And when I looked at when it was released, guys, this movie was released almost 30 years ago. And I couldn't believe it. For real, I was surprised. And it's this movie here, Dumb and Dumber. Are there any fans of Dumb and Dumber in the house? Anyone? All right, exactly. You are not spiritual if you do not like this movie. So to me, this movie is almost 30 years old, which now some of y'all feel old, don't you? And you're welcome for that. But this is one of those movies, like I said last week, that is somewhat of a rite of passage in our home. So as I shared last week, Star Wars is a set of films and shows that we watch in our house. If you're born in the Dunn house, you're going to watch those. And this movie's another one. And the reason why is because this movie, believe it or not, is filled with lots of great life lessons that I want to teach and pass on to my kids. Now, you probably think I'm a terrible parent because of that, but you hang on and don't judge me. I'll show you one of these life lessons in a minute. So there's a lot of life lessons in this film that they're funny, but they're there. And one of the ones that I like the most is this scene where Lloyd, who's played by Jim Carrey, is driving down the road while Harry, his partner in crime, is beside him and he falls asleep. He gets some shut-eye. And while they're driving, Harry begins to snore, which absolutely annoys Lloyd. So Lloyd is leaning over, some of y'all remember this, and he's trying to stop Harry from snoring. Remember this? So he's pinching his nose, and then he starts breathing, snoring out of his lips, so he's, pinching his lips. And as he's doing this, he approaches this place where he has to take a turn. And he's not paying attention. And so one direction was to Aspen, Colorado, which is where they were supposed to go. And then the other turn was to Lincoln, Nebraska. And while he's doing all this, he takes the Lincoln, Nebraska turn and just cruises on down that direction. Well, after hours and hours of driving, they finally run out of gas, and they're stranded on the side of the highway in the middle of nowhere. And it's there that Lloyd and Harry have a conversation about this predicament that they were in. And I want to show you this little clip.
Come on, stop being a baby. So we backtracked a tad.
Tad? A tad, Lloyd? You drove almost a sixth of the way across the country in the wrong direction. Now we don't have enough money to get to Aspen. We don't have enough money to get home. We don't have enough money to eat. We don't have enough money to sleep.
Well, it's not going to do us any good to sit here whining about it. We're in a hole. We're just going to have to dig ourselves out.
Some of y'all right now are like, can we just watch the rest of the movie and skip your message? Yeah, we're not going to do that. I spent too much time on this. But in that moment, believe it or not, there is a great life lesson. And I'll share with you the insights that I have on this. And this is for free, okay? So what's happened in this moment is here Harry and Lloyd have found themselves stranded in the middle of nowhere, recognizing that you can desire all you want to go to Aspen, Colorado, to experience the slopes of Aspen, Colorado, to enjoy everything that Aspen, Colorado brings to your life. But if you take the wrong direction, you'll never end up in Aspen, Colorado. Is that true? That's a life lesson you can pass on to your kids. That your direction that you take in life, it really does matter. You can desire to end up in certain places, but if you go in the wrong direction, you head in the wrong direction, you will never get there. So here, Lloyd and Harry were just in the middle of this place, and they knew that heading in the same direction they were traveling would not do them any good. But they had to figure out the direction to Aspen, as well as they needed to figure out how to get some gas, which they end up with a moped, and there's a lot of funny scenes around that as well. But this is where they ended up, trying to get back to the place where they had ultimately desired to go. When we started this series a few weeks ago, looking at Here is in Heaven, what we began talking about is how that Jesus, when he began his ministry on this earth, he began to speak in many ways about directions and destinations. That your direction and where you desire to go, it does matter. And Jesus made a lot of very bold statements to people of his day. One of the statements is this one in Matthew 4:17. He said, repent because the kingdom of heaven has come near. He made another statement that Luke records. He said, if anyone wants to follow after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life because of me will save it. Jesus made these statements and other statements, and as we have looked at these statements over the past few weeks, the question we've been wrestling with is, what did Jesus mean by all this? What did he mean that the kingdom of heaven has come near, and as a result, you need to repent? What did he mean by the statement that if you follow me, you will save your life, but if you walk away from me, you will actually lose your life? Now, I don't know how you feel about those statements, but the way I see them is that if you want to take Jesus seriously at all, you have to try to figure out what he meant by these things, because it seems to me that he looked at all these people around him as if they were Harry and Lloyd, that they were stuck, they were stranded, they were in a hole, they were headed the wrong direction. And what he was saying is, you need to stop and you need to follow me and let me get you out of this hole and take you in the right direction. That this is what Jesus was getting at. Now, to understand the life and the teachings of Jesus, you have to begin where the scriptures begin. You have to start in the garden. And the reason why you have to start there is because it's in the garden when humanity began going in the wrong direction. Moses tells us in Genesis, in the very first book of the scriptures, that God created everything. He created this garden. He then took Adam and Eve. He placed them in this garden. And when he put them in the garden, he gave them jobs, gave them assignments, which I know can sound a little distressing or a little depressing to some of us, especially those of us that are retired. But he gave them jobs, which was not a bad thing because he created us in his image to be creators as well as to manage. But the other thing he did is he gave them parameters in which they were to live their lives within. And the parameters he offered them were very simple. They could eat from all the trees in the garden except one. The one tree in the center of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he said, do not touch it. Do not eat from this tree. If you do, you will surely die. Well, you all know the rest of the story. that in that scene in Genesis chapter 3, the serpent, who we know is an angel that had rebelled against God, known as the devil, he approached Eve one day and he began to argue with Eve over what she believed about this warning from God. And here's what he said in Genesis 3. He says, "No, you will certainly not die," the serpent said to the woman. "In fact, God knows that when you eat it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So the serpent approached Eve on that day and began to argue with her and say, no, here's the thing. God is lying to you. The truth of the matter is you will not die, but God is telling you this because what he wants is to keep you under his control. He wants to keep you under his thumb. He wants to remain in this authoritative position in your life that you have to look to him to see for you, to tell you what is good and what is evil, what to pursue and what to avoid. But the devil inferred to her that you can change all this by just taking that fruit, eating it, and then you will be like God. Then you will no longer be under his rule. You'll no longer under his control. You could then see for yourself and live life as you see fit. Now, up to this point in their lives, Adam and Eve had never questioned the heart of God. Never. Because from the time that he breathed life into them, they always had seen God as being there with them, providing for them, having a relationship with them. But in this moment, when they heard this statement, they received the lie like it was the truth. And as they did, they began to see that God didn't really love them. They believed that he wanted to control them. And so what they did is what any of us would have done had we been in their shoes, and we would have believed that. Is they said, I'm not letting him control me. I'm not going to stay under his thumb. And so they took the fruit and they ate it. Now, when I look at this scene, and I look at it quite a bit, because this, to me, Genesis 3 is so powerful, what all's there. It tells us a lot about ourselves. But when I look at this scene and what took place, what I see is that on that day, the number one goal or objective of the devil was really to warp the view that Adam and Eve had of God. He wanted to distort their perspective of him, how they saw him, to not see him for who he really is, but for who he wanted them to see him as. That he wanted to do that. And he knew that if he told them the right thing, that that would change everything. And so the lie that he wanted them to believe is very simple. God doesn't love you. He wants to control you. God doesn't love you. He wants to control you. That was the lie that he wanted for them to believe. And he knew that if they believed this, if they bought this lie, that what they would do is that they would say, I don't want some control freak, some tyrant, some rule giver, some lawgiver to control me. I don't want to be under his thumb, so I'm going to move in the opposite direction. And that's exactly what they did. They moved in the opposite direction by eating the fruit, and then they moved in the opposite direction when he came to see them by running away from him instead of to him, and they hid from him. It changed everything. About 5 years ago, there was this guy here at our church that went through a class that I offered, Discover River City. And if you've never been through Discover River City, this is going to sound like a little bit of an infomercial, but just bear with me. It's a class that we offer about 4 to 6 times a year for people that attend the church and say, we want to take the next step. We want to know more about how to serve, get in community, just more about the church, things like that. And so I offered this class, and there I was hosting. There were about 40 adults in the class. And I started the class, like I always do, with a question, because I like to get discussion, because there's always great discussion in this time together. And so I asked this question. The question I asked is, when you think of church, what word comes to mind? That's it. And as I asked that question on that day, as I had many times before, I began to hear all these people giving me feedback, and it was great. Somebody said something over here, and I was just saying, yep, that's great, awesome, great insights. And then there was this guy seated right dead center, and he looked at me, and then he said, rules. And I stopped, and I looked at him, and he could tell I was somewhat surprised by what he said, and I wanted to make sure I heard him correctly. I said, okay, I said, sir, if you don't mind, will you repeat what you said? Just make sure I heard you correctly. And he looked at me and he said, rules, and because he could tell I was shocked, he then followed that by saying, I'm sorry, I'm just being honest. And when he said that, I let out somewhat of a surprise/nervous laugh, because no one in all the times that I had led this and asked that question, anyone openly said that when they think of church, they think of rules. But he said that. And so I looked at him and I said, well, no, I love honesty, thank you so much. And I said, do you mind sharing with everyone just briefly what happened for you to view church in that way? And thankfully he didn't like to talk a lot, so he made it very succinct, and he said that from his time of being a child and a student and an adult, his experiences of going to church just had led him to see it, to perceive it as all about rules. Well, we moved on, and then when we left that afternoon and I was headed home, felt a little bit of frustration as well as sadness for him. And I told him this, that I was sorry that this is the way he had experienced these things, to where he saw church in this way. But I was also a little, frustrated, because what I didn't want for him was for him to believe that that's true of River City Church. That the last thing I wanted back 15 years ago or so, when we started this church in our living room with just a handful of couples, was for people one day to say, River City Church is all about rules. I mean, that's not what I had in mind. So I really was frustrated, and I was really thinking through, okay, well, how does this work? So in the days and months and years ahead, as I got to know this guy and become a friend of his, I began to just talk to him a little bit more. And what I discovered is that it wasn't really his fault he viewed the church this way. It really wasn't. That the way this had worked, and in fact, he didn't want to see the church this way, but as he attended church throughout his experiences, it seemed like that what was emphasized every Sunday was do this, don't do that. Do this, don't do that. And as he heard this over and over and over again, he began to believe that church was all about rules. But as we continued forward, and as I began to think more about this, it dawned on me one day that the reason why he believed church was all about rules was because he ultimately believed God was all about rules. That he had this warped view of God. He had a distorted view of God. That had he used a word to describe God, he would have said the same word, rules. And as I began to talk through this with him a little bit more, I thought, okay, now I understand. Now, in the time since that conversation with him and other conversations I've had, what I've discovered is that there are a lot of people, to differing degrees, no doubt, that when they think of God, they do think of God in this way. They think God is a God of rules. That they really do believe that that's the case. Some people even believe that this book here is a rule book, that the scriptures are really just a rule book. And as I think about this guy, the way he was communicating, the way he viewed God and the way he viewed church, in his mind, the way he saw it is that God's all about rules. He then has these preachers that are really rule explainers and rule enforcers that gather people together every week to pass rules off to them with the hopes that they'll all go out and obey the rules, that this is really what church is all about. And as I began to think through this, I thought, oh my gosh, well, now I can see why a lot of people don't want to go to church on the weekends. Because who wants to go to church on the weekends to hang out with a bunch of rule enforcers that are just trying to tell everybody to go obey the rules? And I'll go ahead and tell you, if that were the case, I wouldn't be here, okay? I wouldn't be here, because that sounds like a terrible thing, a terrible job as well as a terrible thing to experience. And that is the good news. The good news is that actually, this view that this guy held that day was actually a distortion. It was a warped view. That this is a view of God that began in the garden in the beginning when the devil told Adam and Eve that God didn't love them, he just wanted to control them, and it is still circulating to this day in our minds and hearts in different ways that's leading a lot of us to believe something is true about God that's not true at all. And so what I wanted for him on that day, just like I want for all of us here today as well, is to see the truth about who God really is. Because what I have found and what I've discovered is that when you see him for who he really is, and you receive it over and over again, because we need to receive this truth over and over again, that slowly but surely our mindsets and our hearts begin to shift in how we see him and how we live life, and it absolutely changes everything. And guys, that's why Jesus, coming to this earth, living in his life, teaching what he taught is so important. Because Jesus came to clear up these distortions of God. This is what Jesus meant when he said what we looked at last week in Matthew chapter 11, verse 27. He said, all things have been entrusted to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son desires to reveal him. When Jesus made this statement, what he was getting at is that as he looked at everyone around him, he believed they all had a warped view of God. He said that he was the only one who really knew the Father. He was the only one that really knew the truth about God, and God knew him. But at the good news, he said, but I am willing and able to reveal the truth of God. And this is why he goes on to say this, verse 28. Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take up my yoke and learn from me, because I am lowly and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. What Jesus understood is that in his day, all these people had a warped view of God, and the result was they weren't at rest, they were wearied and burdened. Jesus himself was experiencing rest because he knew the truth of God. He was living life as it was meant to be lived with God. So what he was saying to people is that I understand you have a warped view. You don't know him. You have a distorted view of him. It's leading you down this place. It's leading you in the wrong direction, away from him. But if you will come to me and walk with me, I will reveal the truth of him to you, and I will train you on how you are to live in this life with God. And then he promised that you will find, as you do this, you'll find rest for your soul. So how did Jesus reveal this truth about the Father? How did he reveal who he really is in contrast to these warped views that people had in their day? Well, as you read the Gospels, you'll discover that everything he said and did really got back to correcting these distorted views of God. I mean, everything trails back to that. But there's this one teaching that Jesus offered that is so powerful. It's so clear. It is so life-changing that as you read it and you receive it over and over and over again, you begin to see that, man, it changes everything about how you view God for who he really is. And so this teaching is found in Luke's gospel, and I want to walk you through what Jesus said. Luke begins in Luke chapter 15 with this. Verse 1, he said, all the tax collectors and sinners were approaching to listen to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes were complaining, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. So Jesus was a rabbi. He was a teacher that people looked to and listened as he performed miracles and he taught about God. But the thing that was unique about Jesus, there were multiple things, but there was one thing that was unique, was the fact that he would hang out with, openly, these irreligious people, tax collectors and sinners. And not only did he hang out with them, he would share meals with them, which was a big deal. Because in their day, to have a meal with someone was to show that you accepted them for who they were, where they were. Well, these religious people, the religious leaders, the Pharisees and scribes, as are stated here, they looked at that as a character flaw in Jesus, because their view was that God himself did not accept these people as they are, where they are. So if you're going to speak for God, you don't need to do that either. And so that's why they're criticizing Jesus for doing this. Now, after Jesus catches on that these people are criticizing him, he began to respond to what they had to say. And the way he did this, as you all probably know, is through a series of stories. He goes into storytelling mode or parable mode. He tells a story about a sheep that wanders off, and the shepherd goes and finds it and brings it home. He goes on to tell about a young lady with her dowry and how one coin ended up lost at home. She finds it. And then he launches into this story about a father who had two sons. And if you've been around River City for any length of time, you know that this set of stories is really my favorite story. So I teach on this every year, at least once, because it's so powerful. But it's in this story, Jesus begins to bring clarity to who God really is. And so I'm going to read the story with you all the way through as Jesus would have told it, beginning in verse 11 of Luke 15. And here's what Luke wrote. He said, he also said, a man had two sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate I have coming to me. So he distributed the assets to them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered together all that he had, traveled to a distant country where he squandered his estate in foolish living. After he had spent everything, a severe famine struck that country, and he had nothing. And then he went to work for one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. He longed to eat his fill from the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one would give him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food? And here I am dying of hunger. I'll get up, go to my father, and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven, and in your sight I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired workers. So he got up, and he went off to his father. But while the son was still a long way off, the father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran, threw his arms around his neck, and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven, and in your sight I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father told the servants, quick, bring out the best robe and put it on him, put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and then bring the fattened calf and slaughter it, and let's celebrate with a feast. Because this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. Now his older son was in the field. As he came near to the house, he heard the music and dancing. So he summoned one of the servants, questioning what these things meant. Your brother is here, he told him, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. Then he became angry and didn't want to go in. So his father came out and pleaded with him. But he replied to his father, "Look, I've been slaving many years for you, and I have never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me a goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your assets with prostitutes, you slaughtered the fattened calf for him." "Son," he said to him, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again, and he was lost and is found." Isn't that a powerful story? So why would Jesus respond to these religious dudes who were criticizing him for sharing a meal with irreligious people by telling them a story about a father with two sons? Why did Jesus do this? Well, the answer is actually quite simple. Jesus was communicating to them the truth about who God wanted at his table, who God welcomed to his table. And through this story, what he's explaining is everyone. They believed it would only be the religious, the rule followers. Jesus was showing through this story that it was everyone. Now, the way Jesus went about teaching this truth is so amazing. It's powerful because he reveals this truth in the midst of a story through two different perspectives. There was the perspective of the boys, the sons, and how they saw their father and what they believed about their father. And then there was the perspective of the father and how he looked at his boys and how he felt toward them. As he told the story about the boys, what he was communicating to them, and again, his audience, remember, is both irreligious and religious. Those are the two camps. There's really no in between, it's both. But what he was explaining to them is through these two boys, that these boys both looked at their father in the same way, in the sense that they both believed that what their father ultimately wanted from them was for them to stay home and to serve him. That's what they believed. Now, the difference was in how they responded to what they believed their father wanted. The younger son said deuces to their pop and said, "I'm out of here," and he got as far away as he could from his dad to live his life. He did not want to live under the rule of his dad serving him, so he just took off. But the older son, he handled it very differently. He chose to stay home. He chose to focus on doing what he believed his father wanted him to do, to serve him. They responded differently, but they really believed the same thing. But when you look at the story through the eyes of the father, what you discover is that the father looked at his boys very differently than the way they thought he looked at them. They thought that what he wanted was for them to serve him. But what he wanted, as you see through his eyes, is he just wanted to love on them. You see this through the story as the son who ran off when he came back, believing that he had broken all the rules, and because he didn't stay home to serve and all these things, that when he came back, that he was going to try to work it off by just being a servant. But the father, when he had him back, he didn't treat him like a servant because he was never a servant to him. He never would be a servant to him. He would always be a son to him. So he welcomed him back as his son. He hugged him, he kissed him, he embraced him, he dressed him all up, took him inside, and they had a party. And you also see this truth in the fact that when the older son was outside and was just irate and hacked off because he got wind of how Pop was treating his younger brother who was lazy and didn't want to serve the dad, and then he comes home and he gets this party, that he goes out and as the dad starts talking to this son of his son begins to explain to him through anger as well as in confusion that, "Dad, this is not how this is supposed to work. The way this is supposed to work is the ones that serve you, that do these things like I've been doing, slaving for you for all these years, you're supposed to throw parties for me. Not for my jabroni brother who did what he did, and he comes home and he's lazy and he didn't do any of it, and you do this for him. What are you doing?" He was confused. And what the father goes on to explain to him is, "Son, listen, you have this all wrong. You've been looking at this the whole thing the wrong way. You see, what I am all about as far as throwing parties is when what is lost is found." What he was speaking to is what was lost is not serving and not serving. What was lost when his son left and what he wanted was a relationship. That's what he wanted. He didn't care so much about the serving piece. He just wanted his son back. He wanted the relationship back. Now, this leads to the question, well, who was lost? What we know is pretty obvious. The son who wandered off was lost. True? We know that. That's pretty obvious because that's the focus of what he says. But here's what's interesting. In the two stories that Jesus told before this story about the sheep and the coin, he's actually communicating a lot more there than just about a sheep and a coin. As he spoke about the sheep that wandered off, he wanted you to think about the younger son that walked off. And just as the shepherd went out and found the sheep, that the father went out to his son and brought him home and threw a party, that we know that the prodigal son who ran away, the one who was a rule breaker, he was lost, no doubt, but also there's a story about the coin. This young lady who's at home loses a coin. She's missing one. She ransacks the house. She finds this one coin. What does she do? She calls up her friends, her family, texts them all, get over here. We're throwing a party. And they all came over and they partied because the coin that was lost had now been found. But the coin never rolled off down the street. The coin was lost at home. And what Jesus was saying in that story was when he was telling the story about this older son, is that he too was lost. That there was no relationship between him and the father. And the reason why was because his view of his father was distorted. He didn't really think, just like the younger brother didn't think, that their father wanted to love on them. What they thought is that he just wanted them to serve them. What's important in this is to see, I believe, what Jesus was all about. John, in his letter that he wrote after Jesus' resurrection and ascension, he made a statement. We looked at this a couple of weeks ago, but it's so important to view it again. In 1 John 3:8, he said that the reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil. This is the reason why Jesus came to the world. Ultimately, it was to destroy the works of the devil in the lives of people. What was he after? Well, what Jesus knew, and this is what you see all throughout his life, is that this lie in the beginning that distorted the thinking of people, how they saw God, not as a loving father, but more as someone that wanted to control you and just give you all these rules and all these things and have you serve him, that had warped their view, and as a result, this was leading them away from God. And what Jesus came to do was to say, no, time out. Let me tell you the truth about him. The truth is, he's your father. You're his sons, you're his daughters. Yes, you're responding to him differently because you've had these warped views that Satan has convinced you of. Some of you, you're running, you're saying you're breaking all the rules or whatever because you're like, you're not going to control me. Others of you, you think, well, he just wants me to serve, and if I serve, then I'll get the estate, so I'm going to do that. And so you're religious. But what Jesus was saying is, he's neither one of those things. That's not what he wants. He wants you. He wants your heart. He wants to love on you. You see, what the devil knows is that if he can keep us believing a distorted view of God, that we'll never find rest for our souls, guys. We'll remain weary and burdened because we'll continue to think of him in a way that he's really not. And so we won't go to him and let him love on us. But the truth of the matter is your soul was created to experience the love of your Father every day. And it's when you let him love on you that you find the rest that your soul is longing for. As I've thought about my life and my journey, and many of you know this, I grew up a preacher's kid, so I've been around church my entire life, from the womb till now. But what I have seen is that we really struggle with letting God love on us. I struggle with letting God love on me. After the first service, I heard from some other folks that they said that they too struggle with this. But what I've discovered is that the more you see this truth about your Father, as Jesus communicated, and you believe that he loves you and all he wants to do is love on you, that that's where it starts, you're drawn to him. You're drawn to him just to spend time with him like you would with anyone that you knew just loved you and wanted to just be with you. You're not repelled by that. You're drawn to him. And so the more that I see that he loves me that way, the more I'm drawn to him, the more I go to him and just let him love on me, what begins to happen is my view of what he says to do or not to do begins to change from seeing them as rules where he's trying to control me or things I have to do, where I start to see them as actually from the heart of someone who loves me, who wants the best for me, who's saying, Jonathan, this is the way I've designed for you to flourish in life. If you do this, you'll flourish, and that's what I want for you, so go live this way. That these are things that come from the heart of a father who loves you, kind of like us as parents. When we instruct our kids, we're not trying to be dictators, are we? We love them. We want the best for them. That's the heart of our Father toward us. And the more you let him love on you, the more you understand that's what's going on here. It's not what the devil tells you. So here's a question I have for all of you this morning I want for you to consider, and I think it's important. It's similar to what I asked at Discover River City, but it's a little different. And the question is this: when you think about God, do you think of him as law or love? Law or love? Which one really hits you first? Do you see him as about rules and commands and laws and all this stuff? Or do you tend to think of him first and foremost as Father? A loving Father. Which one? And this is important because if you tend to see him as being about law, you are going to feel the tension, as irreligious and religious people do, or like the two sons did, over how you're going to respond to that. You're either going to run, you're going to reject his rules and say, you're not going to control me, or you'll try to do some rules but not others, or you will begin to live like those that want to just obey the commands, but you don't really let him love on you because you don't see that that's really what he wants to do. Now, I will tell you the way that you can know if you believe that it's all about law, or mainly that, is the fact that you'll find this rebellious attitude or frustration toward God when you read scriptures. You won't want to hear people talk about what he's saying because you're not seeing him through the heart of a God who wants the best for you. So you'll feel that way. Or you'll be one of those people that'll be like, yeah, man, give me more, give me more, give me more. But here's the way that you're viewing that, okay? You're viewing it like the religious, legalistic Pharisees of Jesus' day. Because here's the thing about them. They love to study the scriptures. They love to study the law. And the reason why is because they believe they were just pros at actually fulfilling it. But what's interesting in this story, what you can tell about legalistic people, Pharisees, if you will, is that in that story, remember the older brother starts getting upset and he's saying all this stuff to his dad about his brother? Remember how he referred to his brother? He said, that son of yours? See, judgmental, legalistic people that really think a lot of themselves, that are filled with pride, that aren't letting God love on them, they begin to start creating distance between them and other people, like they're better. That's what they do. It's just kind of like, I'm better, I got this, and they start judging everybody else. And that's what the Pharisees did. But it's funny how in that story that when the father responded to this legalistic son of his, what he said to him is, your brother. He said, you're just alike. You are brothers. You're responding differently, but you're still both my boys. So where are you in your walk with God? Do you see him as law or do you see him as love? Now, if you see him as love, what you know is what I'm talking about here today. Is that, man, his love is amazing. There is nothing like it. And you know that this is what you long to experience every day more than anything. Because when you go in and you just let him love on you and you say, Father, and you pray and you worship and you read the scriptures and you just spend time with him, that there is nothing like that in your life. But here's my belief this morning. I think there's a lot of us, guys, that are not experiencing the love of God enough because we've had some level of a distorted view of him. We've thought of him as law. That's why we don't spend enough time with him. And my hope for all of you this morning, through what we've looked at, is that you would be encouraged to see, okay, I'm here. I want to enjoy God. But if I keep going in the same direction I'm going in, I'll never get there. So what I need to do is I need to trust what Jesus said. And I need to go to the Father, and I need to let him love on me. I've asked the band to lead a song here in just a few minutes that I think is very fitting. And the song that they're leading is Run to the Father. It's all about his love, all about his grace, and how we want to run to him daily. And this is just a picture of what he invites us to do every day. And before we do that, we're going to take communion in just a moment if you'd like to, but I want to ask you to just bow with me for a few moments and to reflect on just where you are with God. And just in this moment, I would like for you to just think about, as you look to the Father, and just maybe in your mind's eye, imagine that you're looking to the heavens to God. Have you seen him and been thinking of him and approaching him with a view of him being law or love? And if it's been law, will you just, in your heart, pray and say, Father, thank you for today, that we get to look at what your Son, who you loved us so much you sent him to this world for us, to know the truth about you, about who you really are, your heart for us. And beyond that, that you sent him to give his life on the cross to atone for our sins so that we too can know you as Father. Just thank him for that. Maybe you just tell him, Father, every day I just want to let you love on me. I haven't been doing that. I've been putting busyness ahead of you, craziness of work and kids and stress and pressure, all these things have been driving me away from you instead of me choosing to just be still with you. And God, I don't want to do that anymore. I just want to let you love on me. Father, we are grateful. We're so grateful that you do love us, that there is nothing like your love. We thank you that you sent your Son for us to teach us, to make it possible for us to experience this love through him. And so, Father, as we now remember Jesus, him laying down his life for us, as we take the bread and the cup, I pray that you would just do something special in our hearts.